In Vietnam, January 30th was like their big New Year's Eve called Tet. It kicked off a week of celebrations. But in 1968, during Tet, things got crazy. There was supposed to be a break from fighting, but sneaky Vietcong rebels took advantage of the truce. Instead of celebrating peacefully, they attacked over 100 towns and cities in South Vietnam, even hitting 12 U.S. air bases. This big surprise attack was called the Tet Offensive, and it went on for about a month until American and South Vietnamese troops managed to take back control. The guy in charge, General Westmoreland, said it was a huge win for us because we killed a lot more of them than they did of us. But even though we technically won, it made a lot of people back home lose faith in the war. It felt like the enemy was everywhere, and folks started thinking maybe we couldn't win after all. Even the big shots in the White House were shocked. The new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, said after Tet that America should just give up trying to win. The Tet Offensive also made President Johnson look bad. By the end of February 1968, most people didn't like how he was handling the war anymore. Almost half the country thought sending troops to Vietnam was a mistake in the first place. Even before all the craziness of the Tet Offensive, there were people in the Democratic Party who wanted to kick out President Johnson because of the war. They wanted someone else to run against him in the 1968 primary election. They asked Robert Kennedy, who was a senator from New York, but he said no. But then this other senator named Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota said yes. He wanted to run against Johnson to end the war. McCarthy surprised everyone by almost beating Johnson in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. That made Johnson look really weak, so then Robert Kennedy decided he wanted to be president too. But now the Democratic Party was split because some people wanted Johnson and some wanted Kennedy. So then Johnson went on TV and said he was going to try to make peace in Vietnam. And he dropped a bombshell. He said he wasn't going to run for president again. That was a big shock to the country. But then things got even crazier. On April 4th, someone shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr., who was a big leader in the civil rights movement. People all over the country were so angry that riots broke out in over 100 cities. Then, 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was also assassinated. And while all this was happening, college campuses were going wild with protests against the war. In just the first 6 months of 1968, almost 40,000 students at over 100 colleges joined in protests. A lot of these protests were against the Vietnam War, but some were about other issues too. Like at Columbia University, students took over some buildings to protest against the school's rules, and the police ended up arresting almost 900 of them. In August 1968, the Democrats gathered in Chicago for their big presidential convention, where they were supposed to pick their candidate for president. But it wasn't much of a choice because the party leaders had already decided on Vice President Hubert Humphrey. This made a lot of people who were against the war, like McCarthy supporters, really mad. Around 10,000 anti-war protesters showed up in Chicago. Some just wanted to push the Democrats to take a stand against the war. Others wanted to make it clear they didn't like Humphrey. And then there were some who just wanted to cause chaos to make the Democratic Party look bad. Things got really out of hand in a park downtown, away from the convention hall. The police started going after thousands of protesters, spraying them with mace and hitting them with sticks. Some protesters ran away, but others fought back. All this violence showed just how split the Democrats were. Meanwhile, the Republicans were way more together. They picked Richard Nixon as their guy for president. Nixon said he'd bring law and order and promised to end the Vietnam War. Plus, a third-party candidate, George Wallace, took a bunch of votes away from Humphrey. So, in November, Nixon won the election. Now, it was up to him to figure out what to do about Vietnam.